So tonight's Torah portion is really, I'm going to teach only from chapter 35, actually 30, 33, and 35. So, because there's one theme there that I would like to emphasize on. It has to do with God's protection and God's keeping Israel as a separate people in the midst of the land of Israel. And so that's really the theme of tonight's Torah portion. Now, all right, so now God's going to protect Israel. Tonight's Torah portion, we'll see God's going to protect Israel not only from hostile enemies, Canaanites, but from the prospect of assimilation as well. We're going to see that in two occasions where he would keep Israel so that they would not become assimilated with the surrounding people, even his own brother Esau, the Edomites. Now, all right, so let's begin. All right, so before we begin, I want us to consider the strength of the Canaanite people. They were very, very strong people. They had fortified cities. They were mostly merchants. They were there in the land of Israel to conduct mercantile activity. The land of Israel is and was back then even more so a land bridge between three continents. I'm talking about Europe, Africa, and Asia. So the land of Israel is that land bridge. In fact, when you look at this land bridge, it's fairly sizable, but actually the part of that land bridge that would be communicable, where people would in fact commute back and forth, is very small. I'm talking about Judea and Samaria and the coast. So that area right there is perhaps at its extent about 30 miles across. So this 30-mile barrier, or 30-mile bridge actually, is where the Canaanites had planted themselves. Now the Canaanites being there was certainly a ploy of the devil. Certainly was, because the Canaanites were just an evil people. They were pagans of the worst degree, and they were hostile towards God, incredibly hostile towards God. They worshiped the Molech, the Ashtoreth, and the Baal, and they were committed to these fertility gods. And so, what did the enemy do? Well, he placed this horrible people, the Canaanites, the sons of Canaan, and there were many of them, in this place. And what would be his objective? What would be the enemy's objective? To prevent Israel from prospering in that place. You see, the devil had some dimension of foresight, knowing that God's hand was on the land of Israel and the people of Israel. The devil knew this from before, and he determined that he would plant his instruments in that place to perhaps prevent God's people from prospering. That's the devil's ploy. The devil does, in some cases, go before us. He does have some sense of foreknowledge. Now, so the Canaanite people were an abundant people. They occupied the land all the way from just north of Samaria, south of the Galilee, all the way down to Beersheba and into the Dead Sea area. So they plugged the entire region up with paganism, with satanic worship, demonic activity, the entire area that would actually be given to Israel. That most important area, Judea, Samaria, and the Negev as well. So, let's talk about the Canaanites. Now, God had a plan for the Canaanites, the Amorites and the Canaanites, the whole extent of them. God had a plan for them, and his plan was to give them 400 years to repent, to turn around from their evil, and if they would, I think God would have done something with them, but he had prepared Abraham's descendants to be the instrument of vessel, the vessel that will bring judgment to the Canaanite people. We saw that back in Genesis chapter 15, and we'll go take a look at that. But what I want to illustrate for you is that the Canaanites, as horrible and just devilish as they were, God had a plan for them, an opportunity for them to repent, but they would not. God knew that they would not, but he wanted to extend that to them. 400 years. So let's go back and take a look at that back in Genesis chapter 15. We looked at this several weeks ago. So Genesis chapter 15. Who knows what the significance of Genesis chapter 15 is? Very significant chapter in the Bible. Who knows what it is? This is when the covenant was cut between God and Abraham, right? It's also where Abraham began to believe God and attain to a dimension of righteousness by his faith. This is where we first begin to recognize that reality, that dynamic of faith for righteousness. That's what it says in Genesis chapter 15, that Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him, Abraham, as righteousness. Then, following that occasion, God would cut the covenant with Abraham, an eternal covenant. We know about that covenant. We're going to see tonight that covenant will be extended to Israel or Yaakov. Remember that Jacob, Yaakov, is no longer Yaakov. He's now Israel. And his attributes are to follow his new name. God assigned him a new name, and together with that, a new attribute, which Israel is beginning to walk out in tonight's Torah portion. All right, so let's take a look here at Genesis chapter 15 concerning the Canaanites who are in the land, and they are abundant and very strong in the land. God has promised Abraham to this point the land. His descendants would have the land. Remember that the land is a very essential part of this covenant, right? The covenant really is about the land and the people. Later on in the prophets, we'll see that the land and the people are God's inheritance, God's nakalah. And that's not something to blink at. That's a very important reality, that the land and the people are God's inheritance. And here God is establishing that covenant by which he would later on receive that inheritance. No one has an inheritance without receiving it. You follow? So if Israel and the land of Israel is God's inheritance, it means that he will receive that inheritance at some time. And that's a different focus, and we won't go there. But in the meantime, there is a clog of Canaanites in the land. And the land is corrupt because of their activity. So I think I should pick it up from where I want to read. Verse 13. Let's pick it up in 12. We'll read 12 to 21. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. Now God had just cut the covenant with him. God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in the land that is not theirs. What land belongs to them? The land of Israel, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterwards they will come out with many possessions. Of course, he's referring to Egypt. As for you, you shall go to be with your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. Then in the fourth generation, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. So there is a ripening, effectively, of the sin of the Amorite that God is preparing for. It will take 400 years. And again, my position is that within that 400-year period, God is offering the Canaanites an opportunity to repent. But he knows that they would not. They are entrenched. The wrath of God is upon these people. According to Paul's standards, what is the wrath of God? That they no longer hear from him. A person or a people who has turned their back sufficiently upon God or away from God would and can get to the point where they're not even hearing from God anymore. The wrath of God is upon them. And so the Canaanites are certainly in this place. The Canaanites turned away from worshiping the God of Israel. Yes, there was a time even the sons of Canaan knew and worshipped the El Elyon, the God of the Bible. But they turned away from him. And of course, if you turn away from God to proceed to worship demonic gods, demonic hosts, what will happen? Well, the wrath of God will fall upon you. And so this is the Canaanite people. What was the population of the Canaanites? I don't know. But some scholars determine that they're in the numbers of the millions. They're in millions, 3-4 million people representing the Canaanite people, all the way from Samaria, north of Samaria, to Beersheba and to the Dead Sea. Millions. We don't know exactly how many. All right, so let's go on. In the fourth generation, they will return here, the sons of Israel, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Why the Amorites? Because the Amorites were the leading tribes of the Canaanites. They were the leading tribe of the Canaanites. So when God saw the Canaanites, he saw the Amorites. They were the governing tribe of all of the Canaanites. It came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch, which passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. The Kenites, the Kenizzite, the Cadmonite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Rephaim, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Girgashite, and the Jebusite. This is about a quarter of the ites that were in the land that's mentioned. There's at least two-thirds more Canaanites. So the land was covered with Canaanites at the time of Yaakov, at the time of Israel. So God now is bringing Israel into the land of Israel and his sons. How many people did they comprise of? Perhaps no more than 24, 30 people at that time. There was Jacob, his 12 children, his 2 concubines, 2 wives, their maids, their servants, and probably at the most 30 or 40 people. And he had flocks as well. So Jacob was very susceptible, very vulnerable to the peoples around them, to the Canaanites around them. So he's coming into the land. Now, we know that initially Israel was really concerned about Esau. All right? Esau was on his way to have revenge, to take retribution on Jacob. Now, that can be somewhat debatable. Some people might actually debate that. If you look at the story in its full context, it's not necessarily obvious that Esau was coming for revenge. But you have to deduce that he must have been coming for revenge. All right? When Jacob left the land of Israel, Beersheba, Esau wanted to kill him. That's why he left. So Esau is aware that Jacob, Israel, is on his way back, and he's coming with 400 men. You're not going to mount up a party of 400 men just to welcome your brother into the land that you really hate. You really wanted to kill him to begin with. So something happened with Esau. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly what. Some people say it's because Esau realized that Jacob had much. He was blessed by God. He had an abundance of flock, and he was prosperous. And Esau made a determination that, well, maybe it's better that I should bless him. Maybe it's better for me that I should join him. Maybe he can become part of my clan. Maybe, perhaps, that's what Esau thought. But I think at any rate, it was God who intervened on behalf of Yaakov, on behalf of Israel. It was God who changed the heart of Esau. Whether Esau made a deliberate decision based on what was lucrative for him, because there is some evidence of that. Nevertheless, whatever the reason is for Esau's change of heart, it was God who changed his heart, turned him around. And in doing that, he protected Israel. Clearly he did. But he didn't only protect Israel from an immediate conflict with Esau, he protected Israel from a simulation. That Esau wanted Jacob, Yaakov, his brother, to assimilate with him. And he offered him that some of his people would stay with him. He said, let me go with you. Right? We're going to read that here in a moment. So the threat from Esau was twofold. Not just that he would attack Yaakov and destroy what Jacob had, but that he would also press in to assimilate, to absorb Israel into his, because he was a mighty nation, right? In chapter 36 of tonight's Torah portion, we see all of the generations of Esau, and Esau had many offspring, and they had many offspring. So Esau had become a powerful people, the Edomites, a whole nation unto themselves. So perhaps, I'm not saying perhaps, I'm saying certainly, the threat against Israel was twofold. One, again, that Esau was on his way to destroy him. Esau had a change of heart, and then Esau determined that, well, maybe I'll just absorb him into my nation. And God prevented that from happening. Let's read about it. In chapter 33, I'm going to read 12 to 16. Esau makes an offer to Israel, 12 to 16. Then Esau said, let us take our journey and go. So all of a sudden it's us, you and I, and we're all together, right? Let us take our journey together, he says, and go. And I will go before you. But he said to him, this is Jacob now, my Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the flocks and the herds which are nursing are a care to me, is a care to me, a concern, I guess, to me. And if they are if they're driven hard one day, all the flocks will die. Please let my Lord pass on before his servant, and I will proceed at my leisure, according to the pace of the cattle that are before me, and according to the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord at Seir. So Jacob is wise enough to refuse. He's not accepting what Esau is offering him. Esau said, let me leave with you some of the people who are with me. So Esau didn't stop there. You see, the spirit in Esau is so determined, or driven, I should say, to interfere with Israel, that he would let me leave some of my people. What do you think that number would have been? More than the number of Israel. So you see, the enemy here, the adversary, is working to set up the opportunity for Israel to be assimilated. The devil's at work here. He's not just going to, lay back and let this thing happen right before him. So Esau is now proposing that some of us, maybe 100 of us, there's 400 here. I have a large nation of people. I'll leave you 100 people. All right? Maybe that's what he's saying. But he said, what need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. So Israel is saying, no, there's no need for it. Now, let me say this before I go any further. Yes, in the natural, there was a need for it. Think about it. Israel, a company of no more than 30 people, I should say, children, women, are about to enter into a very hostile region, the region of the Canaanites. And so, yes, he could have used the protection. And perhaps that was what Esau was thinking. You can use some of my men to protect and watch over you, because you're entering into a very hostile land. But you see, Jacob, or Israel, at this early stage in his walk with God, is beginning to know that this is about he and God. Himself, trust in God. And that his trust should be only God. Because in the natural, Jacob would have easily received the help from Esau. Again, he's about to enter into a very treacherous area, the region of the Canaanites, who are hostile. Incredibly hostile. But you see, my point is, Israel is beginning to trust God at this point. Okay? So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. Jacob journeyed to Sukkot and built for himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore the name is placed Sukkot. So Jacob refused the help from Esau. Perhaps it was the hand of God or the Spirit of God prompting Jacob that even though this may seem to be a good thing, you're going to need help, you're going to need protection and fortification, go by yourself. Perhaps this is what was happening. I want to believe that. So right there, God led Israel away from the potential of assimilation. You see, Israel is to remain a nation set apart, holy unto God. Now, there's nothing written like that to this point. There's only a covenant that Israel is aware of, that God will remind him of shortly. We'll see it. But I guess the reality is Jacob knew that Israel was to be a nation set apart. They were to be a nation set apart, and not to assimilate with the other nations. Perhaps this is what was being quickened in Jacob as he went forward. Now, so God protected Jacob here, or Israel, in two cases, from Esau's hostility, from his violence, and from Esau's good ideas about assimilation. So what happens? Jacob crosses over, Israel crosses over, and he makes his way to Shechem. Now, he's accepted at Shechem, which is amazing, because the Canaanites are hostile, right? But he's accepted at Shechem. He purchases some land at Shechem, and he begins to homestead at Shechem. What happens at Shechem? Something very unfortunate happens. Dinah is taken by Shechem. Who was Shechem? Shechem was the son of the Canaanite, the Hivite, Hamor that inhabited the land. Hamor was the ruler, the king of the region of Shechem. He had a son whose name was Shechem. And we know what happened, right? He took Dinah, he forced himself on her. And following that, he determined that, well, this should be my wife. You know, let me have. He petitioned his father Hamor to get Dinah to be his wife. And so there was some back and forth with Jacob, with Israel, I should say, and Hamor, and they were discussing it. Israel kept it from his sons. He didn't want to excite his sons too much, but ultimately his sons did find out. And they were angry. They were enraged, right? And they came up with a plan, a deceptive plan, by which they would destroy the people of Shechem. Now, it's not real clear that the plan to annihilate the people of Shechem was their determination at the beginning. Perhaps initially they thought of something. Maybe they all need to be circumcised like us, and along the way they decided, well, now that they're circumcised, we'll just kill them all. We don't know. But at any rate, the sons of Israel intended evil, right? So who were the sons that perpetrated the act? Simeon and Levi. And so this horrible thing happened. Now, even there, the Hittites, or not Hittites, the Hivites, because Hamor was a Hivite, a Canaanite, even there was an initiative with the Canaanites, with the Hivites, with Hamor, to assimilate Israel into the people of Shechem. And we see that. Let's read that. Again, another attempt to assimilate Israel into the people of the land. Where am I at? What do I want to read? Chapter 34, I'll read 18 to 23. Is that right? I hope it is. Yeah. So, this is at the time when the proposition has been made that all of Shechem would circumcise and assimilate into Israel. So, you think for sure that the Hivites would say, no, we're not going to circumcise. You need to assimilate into who we are. But for whatever reason, Hamor said, okay, we will all circumcise. But his intent was to absorb Israel. There were a larger number of people than Israel were. The Hivites were significant in number. And Israel was maybe 30 people at most. So, of course, Hamor and the Hivites are thinking, we'll just do the circumcision thing. We'll marry off our son Shechem to Dinah, and that will be it. They will all absorb into us. They will become us. So the threat here is really a simulation again. All right, let's read it. Chapter 34. What did I say? 18 to 23. Excuse me. Now their words, the words of the sons of Israel, seemed reasonable to Hamor and Shechem, Hamor's son. The young man did not delay to do the thing, because he was delighted with Jacob's daughter. Now he was more respected than all the household of his father. So Hamor and his son Shechem came to the gate of the city and spoke to the men of their city, saying, these men are friendly with us. Therefore let them live in the land and trade in it. You see, the Canaanites are all traders, right? They're all mercantile people. For behold, the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters in marriage and give our daughters to them. So he is talking about a simulation. Now, from the standpoint of the nation of Israel, God's intentions for the nation of Israel, this is annihilation of the nation of Israel. Right? The prospect of a simulation means annihilation, especially at this point in Israel's history. Only on this condition will the man consent to us to live with us, to become one people. You see that? He is seeing Israel and the Hivites becoming one people. That every male among us be circumcised as they are circumcised. Will not their livestock and their property all their animals be ours? Let me read that again. I botched it up. Will not their livestock and their property and all their animals be ours? Only let us consent to them that they will live with us. So the issue here is a simulation. This is an incredible threat against Israel. So one might say, wait a minute, Simeon and Levi did something that averted that threat. It did. Because the prospect of there being peace between the Hivites and Israel was real. It was real. You follow my logic? What Simeon and Levi did drove a wedge completely between the Hivites and Israel. Now that's a different perspective because we always fault Simeon and Levi. That's violent what they did. How terrible what they did. They beguiled or they deceived the people and they did this terrible thing. It was terrible. But yet God used it to separate Israel from the Hivites. You see that? All right, I'm not stepping on your toes, am I? But it's very clear. You see, God will take what the enemy uses for evil and he will use it for good. That's a principle throughout the Bible. The devil has his plans and he does his thing, his intentions, and God will work within the context of the evil one's plan to bring about his end. So, Simeon and Levi were murderous and vengeful, and they went out to take revenge, but God used that whole thing to separate Israel completely from the Hivites. Because the next thing we see in chapter 35 is God says to Jacob, arise and go. And Jacob didn't resist. Why? Because there was this incredible tension between the Hivites and Israel. So, clearly, God took that opportunity to send Jacob on his way. So in chapter 35 now, verse 1, the word of God comes to Jacob again. Now the word of God came to Jacob just a few times before this. Maybe twice before this. 3 times actually. 3 times before this, the word of God came to Jacob. All right? First time when he met him at Bethel. The second time when God said to him, the sons of Laban are against you. Get up and go. And the third time when God encouraged him to go on the way, to leave. God spoke to him. And here God is speaking to him again. And God said to Jacob, to Israel, arise, go to Bethel and live there and make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. So God gave him a directive, leave. God is seeing here the opportunity for him to leave. And what does Jacob do? Well, he packs his things up. He's on his way because things are tough in Shechem anyway. But something happens that's indicative of God's work in Jacob. Something happens here that points to the fact that Jacob, or Israel, Jacob is no longer Jacob, he's quickly becoming Israel. Now it's interesting because in this same chapter, God reiterates to Jacob that your name is not Jacob and that your name is Israel. Because sometime before this, no one knows how much time it was, how long before this, God spoke to Jacob about his name not being Jacob anymore. Now here some time has gone by, he's lived in Shechem for some time, and God is speaking to him again, and God reminds him that your name is not Jacob. Your name is Israel. All right? So what happens? What is the thing that happens that points to the fact that Jacob is in fact Israel, that he is in fact transformed? He directs his family, his tribe, to get rid of the idols that are among them. to remove the idols. And we see that in chapter 35, verse 2. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, put away the foreign gods which are among you, and purify yourselves and change your garments. So a complete change is what Jacob is instituting with his whole household. Change of clothes, purify yourselves. In other words, wash yourselves with hyssop or something. Purify yourselves. Get rid of the idols. Change your clothes. God's going to do something special with us. So he has already delivered, to this point, he has already delivered Jacob from Esau. Esau had on two accounts, Esau had represented the destruction of Israel. Again, one, physical destruction. Two, assimilation. Annihilation by assimilation. And then some time goes by, the same thing happens with Shechem. God intervenes. And he's sending Israel now on his way to Bethel. Israel is aware that this is a momentous occasion. This is not just another journey here. This is important. I'm going to Bethel, where I first met God. Purify yourselves. You see, I want to reflect here the complete transformation of Jacob. Compared to Jacob of 20 years ago. The Jacob of 20 years ago had a completely different way of dealing with God and responding to God. Here, he is obedient to God. Here, he's actually exhibiting his love for God. So Jacob, having been touched by God, he now expresses his love for God. Right? And so this is where Jacob's at right now. So now God appears to him again. Verse 9, I'm going to read for you 9 to... where do I want to go? 9 to... I have it written here somewhere. Maybe not. Anyway, we're going to read what God said to Jacob. In verse 35, I'm going to read, let's say, 9 to... Why not? 9 to 13. All right. Then God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram, and he blessed him. And God said to him, your name is not Jacob, your name is Jacob, your name is no longer Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. Thus he called him Israel. God also said to him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from you. Now, what does that remind us of? The Abrahamic promise, the promise to Abraham by God. The land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give to you, and I will give the land to your descendants after you. Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. So God now appears to Jacob, to Israel, on the way to Bethel, and does this incredible thing. Now it says there at the end of it, in what we read, verse 13, that God went up from him. What does that imply? What's the implication? Right, that God had come to him. If God went up, then he must have come down. So God came to Yaakov. Now we don't know in what manifestation, but in some form, God stood before Yaakov, the Lord did, and communicated to him the promises of Abraham and Isaac, extending that to him. And then God went up. So you see, his appointment at Bethel was a very important appointment. Okay, why? Because it was at Bethel that Jacob began to interact with God. It was there that God promised him the covenant, that the covenant will be with him. So this is a complete now revolution. Jacob met God at Bethel. He went out into Padan Aram. He suffered everything he did under the control of Laban. He comes back to the land of Israel. There are a couple attempts to assimilate the people of Israel and want to destroy them completely. And he's on his way to Bethel. Now, something happens on the way to Bethel. And that we see in chapter 35. I'm going to read for you chapter 35, verse 5. Now, again, remember how strong the Canaanites were in the land. And they were brutal people. They were numerous and they were brutal. So, verse 5 now, we're going to see here that God actually went before Israel to prepare the way for Israel as they've journeyed through this hostile terrain, this hostile land. So they journeyed, as they journeyed, there was a great terror upon the cities which were around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Israel. They meaning the Canaanites. So a great terror fell upon the Canaanites, the surrounding cities, while God brought Israel to Bethel. There again, God is moving sovereignly to protect Israel as he makes his way through the land, as he makes his way to Bethel. So you see, regardless of how powerful the Canaanites were, and how populous they were, and how rotten and evil they were, God had a plan to protect Israel. And he brought terror upon the wicked so that they would stay in their houses and refrain from attacking Israel. Certainly they would have attacked Israel. God knew perhaps that the evil one was mounting this attack, would mount an attack against his people. And so God prepared a way for Israel. Now, Israel had a word from God. Jacob had a word from God. What a powerful word. What an incredible word, right? Every promise to Abraham will be yours. Israel lived most of his life doubting that, unsure about it. Right? We know that. We know by his actions and the manipulation that he endeavored with his mom, Rebekah, against Esau. We know that there was some uncertainty in Yaakov then, who became Israel, that these promises would be extended to him. Here, all of a sudden, he's seeing the hand of God powerful in his life, leading him towards the fulfillment of the promises. That God is even bringing terror upon mighty nations to prevent them from affecting Israel. What's God doing with Israel? He's bolstering his faith. He's strengthening Israel in a way only God can. God is showing him his power, preparing him for every bit of what he would experience once he leaves Bethel. Because, of course, after leaving Bethel, God would have intervened many more times to protect Israel. What do you think? This is probably the pattern of Israel's life after this occasion, that God intervened constantly to protect Israel. Did God intervene in Abraham's life to protect him from assimilation and from destruction? He did. What about Isaac? Yes, he did. And he did this with Israel as well. Regardless of Israel's shortcomings, and he had a few of them at the beginning, God had a plan for his life. He was called and chosen. He was elected by God, and God was committed to keep him, to watch over him, and to protect him. I want you to think about that as that might apply to you. Are you called and chosen by God? Do you have that testimony? Should you have that testimony that I am called and appointed by God? Yes, you should. Each of us in this room tonight should have that confession that God has called me and appointed me, and I'm like Israel in that regard. God has turned my life around. Very much I was like Jacob. And that's my confession. God has turned my life around. And in the process of doing so, I am now convinced that he will keep me in every struggle, in every difficulty, in every challenge. He has gone before me, and he's protecting me as he goes. We have every reason to believe and to trust God for his providence, his protection, his power, and his going before us, providence. We have every reason to trust him that way. The pattern is here. Now, I want to say this. Was Israel, even after becoming Israel, was he without difficulty? Did he experience a clear and easy walk? No. He was challenged. Those who have a word from God, those who are appointed by God, who are elect, chosen for God's purpose, will experience difficulties. You will. In many cases, the evil one will mount adversity against you. Yes, he will. The key for us is to not be overcome by the wicked one. The key for us is to overcome by faith and in righteousness overcome the adversity of the evil one. We must recognize and expect that the evil one will mount his attacks against us. The people of the land, they were well prepared to attack Israel. God sent terror upon them to prevent them. We have to understand that the people of the land will mount attacks against us. They will come against us. The adversity that we experience as believers is normative for us. But it's not normative. It's not normal for us to succumb to it. We should never succumb to the adversity of the evil one. We should always know that God has gone ahead of us, and he will watch over us and keep us. We have to walk in that. We have to have that conviction and believe it. Walk in it by faith. We say, yes, I am going to experience adversities. Every word of faith comes with tremendous adversity. It's a fact. Yes, I'm going to have that resistance from the evil one, but God has gone ahead of me. He's going to put terror upon my enemies, and I will walk out my call. I will overcome. The key for every believer is to overcome, as Jacob overcame. That's the key for each of us. We have to do away with the Christian deception that once you become a Christian, your life is now just whelmed with all sorts of wonderful experiences. It's all blessings from here on out. That's as a Christian, that's what you're supposed to have. And brother, if you're having difficulty, it means that there are areas in your life that's not surrendered. You're in sin somehow if you're having problems with your life. Now let me say this. If you live in sin, you're going to have problems. Because to whom much is given, much is required. Let me just make that really clear. If you are walking in righteousness, you're refraining from sin, and you're knowing the oppression of the evil one, then you're like Israel walking through the land. You're receiving the resistance of the evil one, the enemy, but believe and be convinced that you will overcome, because God will bring terror upon your adversaries. We have to believe that, because our adversaries will be many. The things that will trouble us will be abundant. You know what I've discovered and I'm learning to walk in? Not accepting the adversities, knowing that they will come, but don't accept them. Be convinced that God will keep you through the difficulties, through the hard times, and that you should not focus on the adversities. Yes, they're going to come. Yes, there are going to be many at times. And at times they will mount up against you. But we have to have absolute tunnel vision on God and his goodness. And don't focus on the adversities. You know, you're praying for loved ones, for instance. You're praying for a loved one or two. And you're praying for years and years that there will be a breakthrough in their lives, be it a husband, a wife, a child, or something, whoever. And you're praying for years upon years for a breakthrough. Sometimes that can become overwhelming. And you begin to pray pray in a manner that's actually fearful. It comes from a place of fear and doubt. Yes, that can happen. I'm praying for my daughter. I'm praying for my son. And I'm praying every day, 3 times a day. I'm wringing my hands before God constantly, as if God needs us to do that. What's happening? Well, we're being consumed and distracted, overwhelmed by our adversity. I'm not saying that you shouldn't petition him concerning your troubles, but petition him and stand in faith. Stand in faith. Be led by the Spirit. There are times when God would say, "You've petitioned me enough." Isn't that what he did with Jeremiah? Jeremiah constantly went before him on behalf of the people of Judah. God said, okay, I've heard you, enough. Don't pray for this people anymore. You see, so Jeremiah, if you read Jeremiah in the book of Lamentations, Jeremiah was horribly distracted for a period. Shortly after God said, pray no more, we see a turnaround in Jeremiah. The following chapters are more focused on what God is doing. See, sometimes it's easy to get to where our adversities will knuckle us down and consume us. And it's all about our troubles. See, adversity is necessary in your life, but it's not to bog you down. You are to overcome them. Recognize that, yes, I have a son, a daughter, I have a husband, or whatever that's ruining their opportunities in life. They're potentially going to destroy themselves. But I'm not going to spend my life on my knees for them. Because that's a point of distraction for me. I'm going to intercede for them, be led by the Spirit, intercede for them. I'm going to press forward and serve God. And overcome. Guess what? The devil may not find that particular family member so attractive following that. Because you've overcome what he's attempting to do there. You might find that he would lift his hands. Oh, but he will look for another way to distract you. That's what the devil does. That's his vocation. That's his existence. Understand that if you're walking in faith, if you're appointed by God, you're going to know these experiences. But you are to overcome. Be able to overcome. All right. So that's Yaakov. That's Jacob. Next week's Torah portion is about Judah. We're going to look at Judah, and there's a wonderful story in there about Judah. It's sort of analogous also with Joseph as well. So, Shabbat Shalom.